Hello, everybody. Welcome to our first remote design systems community meetup. It is May the 6th, 2020. How's everyone doing? And we're presenting out of Toronto, so let us begin. Next slide, please. All right, today we're going to discuss content in design systems. This is hotly anticipated because we often talk about design, we often talk about code, but you must not neglect content among many other things here at Design Systems Community. It is our first remote meetup. Please relax and enjoy. Next slide, please. And since we're presenting out of Toronto, let us begin with a land acknowledgement. The land I am standing on today is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. I also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaty, signed with multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. Next slide, please. Code of conduct applies even on the internet. Please be respectful of each other as we go through this. There will be a live Q&A section as well. Keep it legal, play nice, uphold our conduct and values that are available on our website, designsystems.community, and please protect your privacy. Next slide, please. Now, who are we? I'm Enrico Sacchetti.
Oh, hi guys. I'm Lucy List, a designer at Shopify.
Awesome. I'm Varun Jain. I do product and strategy at TELUS Digital in Toronto and at Design Systems Community. All right, so this is the interesting part. You know who we are, but we want to know where you're joining from. So on the slide, on the YouTube, you can actually scan the QR code and join Slido. You can also use the Slido link with the code 68754, or you could use the link in the description to tell us which city you're joining from.
We're going to spend a few seconds on this slide. So for all of you joining us on YouTube, take a look at this. I am now showing you live data as you respond. The link is in the description below. Please tell us, which city are you watching us from? And you can see in real time as we generate this map of cities. I see Toronto is leading the pack. If this were a race, then Toronto may be winning.
We've got a few folks from New York. We got California, got Brazil.
Ooh.
Vancouver, we got Waterloo.
Here comes the underdog, Hammertown.
We'll give this another 20 seconds.
Brazil, California. Nice.
Niagara Falls. Berlin. Very cool.
I like Berlin here. That's my favorite.
We got Brno from Czech Republic. We got Austin, Puerto Rico, Prague, London. Fantastic. Well, thank you everyone for joining. Next slide. All right, now we want to talk about the design systems community values. So when you're building a design system, you typically take care about these things. You focus on making your experiences accessible. You want to make sure your system is inclusive. You want to make sure that you build a community around for your designers, developers, and content practitioners, your accessibility primes. Your focus is typically customer first. So you want to build something that the customer enjoys and loves to operate on. You want to make sure you're enabling collaboration amongst designers, developers, product owners, content folks. And then value number 6, which is our focus for today, which is bridging the content, design, and code. And the most important one, which is number 7, we're all here to have fun. And we're going to have fun remotely as well. Next slide. All right, some of the DSC updates we have for you today. We're fully remote, so going forward, we will be hosting monthly meetups remotely. Today, if we do experience any technical issues, we are recording this stream today. So if you do have technical issues, it's all good. You will have a recording after the meetup is done. And we're also live on YouTube. So there's a Design Systems Community channel that you can subscribe to. Highly recommend that. We'll be posting meetup recordings there. Next slide. Awesome. So 2 months ago, we sort of grew in size, not only being the Toronto chapter, but we had introduced Berlin chapter. And we're still continuing to grow. And now I want to take the chance to introduce 3 more chapters that are joining Design Systems Community. We got Mexico City, we got Dublin, and we got Czechia. We're super excited to have them part of this growing community. And if you want to start a new chapter of Design Systems Community in your city, you can go on to designsystems.community, which is our website, and apply for being a chapter. All right, so nothing is possible without the sponsors. So first, I want to thank our gold sponsor, Wrangle. They've invested in us for a good year in 2020, so a big thank you to them. I also want to take the chance to introduce our silver sponsor, which is Scotiabank, also the sponsor for today's meetup. So thank you, Scotiabank, and thank you, Eduardo, for making that happen. Before I give it away to Eduardo, I also want to do a big thank you to our volunteers and our sponsors for just growing this community for us. On to you, Eduardo.
Thank you, Varun. So happy to be here in our first virtual design system meetup. So a little bit about me first. I lead the design system initiative in Scotia. So I'm product director there. Design systems in Scotia have been growing for a little bit, and we felt super close to the design system community. So this is a great partnership, and we want to help this community to continue growing. And so just in case you guys don't know this, but we have 5 locations. Digital Factory is located in Toronto, Mexico City, Bogota in Colombia, Lima in Peru, and also in Santiago. I saw a couple of cities in the previous poll. I don't think I saw any of these, so I'm really interested in seeing design systems communities grow in the cities. I'm happy if there's any interest in joining any of the job positions that are open in those cities. I'd be happy to facilitate that as well. The design community in Scotia is pretty big. Actually, we've been growing quite a bit since it all started back in 2016. And as you can imagine, there's diverse fields within the design practice. Content design, of course, is one of them, but as well as design systems, and we have obviously design strategy, research, UX research, product design, and all the usuals you would expect. So if there's any interest, we have open positions right now. Not specifically in design systems. This is a product designer position we have open in Toronto. It's a web designer position. So if you're interested in applying, all information is there. You can also scan with the QR. And obviously we have other positions as well in our Digital Factory site. So feel free to join. As Canvas, our design system, has been growing, we now have an open contributor model. So pretty much everyone that joins ends up kind of helping us get the design system grow more. So happy to collaborate. And if there's any questions, just reach out. I'll pass it to you, Lucy.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Eduardo. So I'm just going to quickly go through the agenda today. So our first speaker will start 12:10, so we're on time. And our second speaker will start at 12:45, and then after that at 1:20, we'll have some closing remarks. Oh, sorry, hold on 2 seconds. So I'm going to first introduce our next speaker, Ryan Bigge. I first met Ryan when we both worked at TELUS. He's currently a senior content strategist at Shopify on the financial services team. Previous to that, Ryan spent a decade as a freelance print journalist before going into digital. He's headed up content strategy meetups here in Toronto, and has also spoken at various conferences, including Abstractions and IA Summit, on topics like improving personalized recommendations and boring UX. So we're so lucky to have Ryan with us today to talk about how content graduated from voice guidelines to pattern and systems, and how Polaris, Shopify's design system, has shaped his work and vice versa. So just a reminder, if you guys kept the link from the Slido, if you can go back to that, we'll be using that for a Q&A. So as the presentations go, if you have any questions, just enter your questions in there, and then at the end of the presentations, we'll run through them if we have time. So without further ado, I'll pass it over to Ryan.
Great.
Hey, Ryan.
Thank you very much. What a wonderful introduction. So as Lucy already said, I'm going to trace the evolution of voice and tone guidelines and how we move to content design patterns and systems. Yes, here's what I'll talk about today. Start by talking about voice and tone guidelines, move into content design patterns, then content and content strategy and design systems, and finally, how you go about adding content, how you contribute back to a design system from a content perspective. So voice and tone guidelines. So this book, Designing for Emotion by Aaron Walter, came out in 2011. There's proof. And I think it had a lot of influence, especially because of this. This is no longer live on the MailChimp site. They've changed their voice and tone guidelines. But for many years, this is what you would see if you went to voiceandtone.com. And what MailChimp, thanks to Aaron and others, did was did their very best to try to anticipate what a user might be thinking and feeling at different moments across the experience of using MailChimp, and then use that as a way to figure out the best way to express the voice and tone, the personality of MailChimp. So in this case, this is someone who's checking how their email newsletter is doing, and they suggest that our personality should come through in this step. Here's another instance, a failure message, an error message. Don't joke around with frustrated people. And then Freddie, that's the MailChimp mascot. He's a funny guy or a funny person. Here, when Freddie's making a joke, you want to surprise and delight our users. So again, very influential, something that people pointed out to me and that I pointed out to other people when I was doing a lot of consulting work as a content strategist. And I would say for almost a decade, because like I said, that book came out in 2011, there's been a focus on conveying brand personality through user interface copy. In 2014, I was working, doing some consulting work on a project for a transit card in Vancouver, the Metro Toronto area. It was in 2014. And they had rules, I would say, not exactly the same as how MailChimp thought about it, but definitely very similar. And as it turned out, they also felt that the Compass brand should be, a little bit funny, but they don't go waka waka, they don't yuck it up. But, where there's a natural moment to make a joke, they said that would be a good idea. And so one of the things I was asked to do, because they had that brand personality guidelines, they have those voice and tone guidelines, is they asked me to see if I could apply that to their frequently asked questions, which was a mistake for a couple of different reasons. One of which, frequently asked questions are, often imperfect, not the best way to convey information. They work, but they're not always the best way to do it. But the other issue here is that people are coming to an FAQ, a frequently asked question, to get information. They're not here for laughs. Despite that, I made a small joke under stored value. Will the money on my card ever diminish or expire? And I said, like true love, stored value does not diminish or expire. That was removed, I think, a few months later, and I've never been happier about an edit in my life. And it taught me a valuable lesson about going too far with voice and tone. Now, having said that, when voice and tone, when brand personality is inserted into a digital experience, and it works. It does work really well. And one example I would give is Slack. On the surface, Slack is really like an enterprise piece of software for people to communicate. But the examples I have up here are these are relatively recent. If you go to do a search in Slack, the help text, the prompt text, they're all different. They have like I don't know, 10 or 12 different cute little messages they have there. They don't get in your way, but if you do happen to read them, input search, beep boop. So it's a small moment. It's in keeping with what Slack does, but it doesn't get in your way. But the problem is that a lot of the time, this is not what happens. So this is one of my favorite Onion headlines. Cheeto's social media team arguing over whether tweet is in Chester Cheetah's voice. And this is from 2014. So this was, a few years after MailChimp's Voice and Tone and that book, Designing for Emotion, I mentioned. Obviously, this is in jest, but you get the idea that it can be very imprecise or very difficult to execute on those voice and tone guidelines. And they're not always doing the thing that you expect them to do. So in summary, and you can definitely make an argument against this, but I think there's sort of a pre-digital mindset happening here when you decide to try and apply a brand personality to digital experiences. As I also mentioned with the Chester Cheetah tweet, precise guidelines are next to impossible. So it really becomes, that voice and tone really becomes the property of the writing team and like a small group of people, as opposed to something you can codify and make, sort of easy for anyone in the company to write in that way. As I sort of hinted at with the Slack example, it can be very difficult to balance jokes with jobs to be done, right? We know that users open an app or go to a piece of software or use a product because they want to accomplish something. They want to do a thing. And so you really want to be careful about getting in the way of someone accomplishing that thing by being, hey, here come the jokes. And then the final shortcoming, I think, of voice and tone guides is they really do ignore the day-to-day realities around design components and UX and how you want to build out a design system and how you want it to function. It floats above, on top of, beside, but it's really never integrated into that UX and UI work in the way that you would wish it to be. So that is that. So the next thing I want to talk about, again, I'm trying to trace an evolution from voice and tone guidelines, which is for quite a while the only thing we had, into what are called content design patterns. What the heck is that? So in January of 2016, I saw this article, and I'll be honest, I knew it was important, but I wasn't quite clear exactly how to take best advantage of what Natalie Shaw was talking about in this article. But what she says, first of all, to take a step back, when she's talking about content design, you can also refer to that as UX writing. You can also refer to that as microcopy. Not quite correct, but very close. But anyway, the idea is you've got UX writing patterns, microcopy patterns. So why do we care? Well, when a UX writer struggles for a few seconds over a phrase, it's only natural to assume that someone else has struggled over it before. And one of the examples she gives is, here's two very similar ways to say the same thing. Download and fill in form, download and complete form. And in the article, Natalie is talking about her experiences at gov.uk, the UK's website for all its citizens. And so she said, you know what, they as a team aligned, and they said download and fill in form was the way that they wanted to use. They wanted to phrase that across the site. They made a decision, it was done. And this is for her where the strength of content design patterns. They offer a solution and people never have to suffer alone again. You don't have to solve the same problem over and over because someone has done that in the same way that design systems would solve certain problems visually. Content design patterns do the same thing. And if you go to our article, there's a link to a Google Doc, and you can view all these different examples of content design patterns that she and her team developed at gov.uk. And there's the download and fill in example again, lots more. I've seen other examples. I've seen other people use this. This is a more recent example of content patterns. It's on the Intuit website. So what's great about this is, unlike the gov.uk Google Doc, which is private and hard to find, this is external. This is an externally hosted website. You can go there and you can find out exactly how Intuit does things. So this is good for other people looking for inspiration, but also obviously great for anyone who works at Intuit and wants to, dive into how content should be working in their various experiences. One of the things I like to call out about what Intuit does, which is so neat, is they talk about writing about the interface. Like, how do you refer to the product that you offer up to people? And that sounds like a simple problem to solve, but it can be really tricky to talk about where to go within your product or service to find things. And then if we look at this is again from Intuit, errors. Tell users what happened, be honest, and let users know what the system did. And if you look, this looks very, very different from what MailChimp was doing. I'm not beating up on MailChimp. I thought at the time, the approach was quite novel and made a lot of sense. But this is much more transactional. This is much more functional, right? Like, it's detailed. It's the kind of thing that if you didn't have a UX writer on your team to help you with, you could go to this as a designer or as a front-end developer or whoever else, and be more confident, be more likely to correctly write an error message. So in summary, when you have content design patterns, it reinforces the value of consistent content. In the same way that you want your product or service to look visually consistent, you also want it to sound consistent, to be written in a consistent way, because users will notice this. And if you start using synonyms or different words to mean the same thing, it can cause confusion or lots of other disagreeable things. The only problem with this approach is, in almost every case, the content design patterns are separated from the visual design components. So guidelines exist, but they're not adjacent. They're not where people might expect them to be or look to find them. So I would describe content design patterns as valuable, but a kind of midway step for content or content strategy in design systems. So now we're getting to the stuff you really came here for: design systems and content strategy. So last year I started seeing a whole bunch of articles like this one from Ryan at Deliveroo, not me, Ryan Cordell. So hey, content design systems need you. And as he put it, sticking to a style is important, but it doesn't speed up the design process, reduce workload, or improve consistency of content patterns. And what I like here is his argument isn't just content is important, it should appear in a design system. He's making a business case. He's making a design ops argument about why having content in the design system is so important. This another article from last year, Kate Kenyon, content, the design system element you forgot. And she talks about, or one of the things she says, is mapping content components to their design equivalents quickly uncovers if what you've created will scale. And I saw this in a couple of different articles that I did in research for this talk. Very important to make sure that your components treat content correctly, in the sense that they will work if the content is translated. They don't break in unusual situations. Just some thought and care has gone into how content is going to work in the container. And then finally, Rachel McConnell, why your design system should include content. And what she says is, when there's a limited number of UX writers, having copy guidance means designers can make educated decisions and work more efficiently. And I referred to this already with the Intuit guidelines. But this is, again, a very important thing to say, because most companies probably don't have as many UX writers, content strategists, whatever you want to call them, as they would like. So when you can let people self-serve, other disciplines come in and accurately figure out what they need to do, it can make a huge difference. So don't forget about me, and that is content. So the good news is there's lots of articles coming out lately that talk about how to make this happen. This article isn't specifically about content in design systems, but what I like, this is by Bobby Wood, it came out a couple years ago. What I like about her approach is that she talks about that voice and tone piece, which is near the top of the pyramid. But this pyramid really gives you a very strong sense of all the other points of contact, communication opportunities that in her case, she was working on Google Pay, that users will have with your product, and how you want to think about, not just the brand aspect, but how that gets translated and expressed in different parts of the experience. And as she puts it, we needed UX copy that extended from marketing through product and across surfaces, including mobile, web, and voice. So again, her article isn't about here's how you seamlessly integrate content into a design system, but I like that she's giving us a full picture and talking about things in an interesting way. Then we have an article from two of the people who worked on that Intuit content design patterns that I showed you before. So similar to the content design patterns, they talk about having a repository of important terms, phrases, and calls to action that are ready to be used over and over. These phrases should be tested, approved, and on brand. And what's great about this is it's saying, you don't have to ignore that voice and tone piece, but that's one piece of the puzzle that you want to kind of test for when you're putting together these common phrases and patterns. Something else they say I really like: if you're defining what a button looks like, it's a good idea to define what that button can say. Do different types of modals, pop-ups, toasts, alerts convey different kinds of messages, right? This is super important. In the same way that we train users or teach users what different visual conventions mean across a product or a service, we want to train or help users, see that a specific kind of modal means a specific kind of thing, and we want to be consistent with how we communicate in each of those different containers. Again, consistency both in the visual aspects and in the content aspects. So in summary, you have a better chance of maintaining content consistency if you can make those content guidelines visible. And when I say visible, I mean they're part of your design system and they're easy to find. Having content in your design system or having content strategy approaches in your design system improves the scalability. It means your components aren't like dumb boxes. They understand the relationship between content and visual design, and they work in lots of different situations. It helps people self-serve, designers, front-end developers make intelligent guesses, and again explains what components can and can't say, which I think is very important. So now I'd like to shift gears just one tiny bit, also have a sip of water, and just reflect a little bit on some of my own experiences working with contributing to a design system, and that being Shopify. So if you don't know, we have a design system. It's called Polaris. It debuted in May of 2017. I'm going to do a very, very quick walkthrough of it. Keep in mind that some of the parts of Polaris that I'm going to show you right now didn't exist when we launched in 2017. Certainly we had a lot of the core guidance and things like that in there, but we've expanded on it over time. But we now have a section called Foundations, which is, as it sounds, talks about experience values, key considerations, how to craft user experience, those sorts of things. What you see on screen is a guide to onboarding flows, which I helped create, and I will talk a little bit more about that process later. We have a content style guide, which is very similar to some of the things I've talked about already, or some of the other examples I've shown. So we have a grammar and mechanics section. We have a vocabulary section. So verb, check out versus check out the noun, very important for us. And then just to give you a sense of the level of detail that are in our guidelines, confirmation titles should be one sentence and avoid using punctuation. And then this goes into body content. Confirmation body content should clearly explain if the action is irreversible. And then we have the components. And as promised, we have content guidelines for each component, which makes me very happy. I know that sounds like a weird thing to be happy about, but it makes a huge difference. footer help should follow this content pattern. Learn more about X. And then this is a banner. Again, very detailed. Body content should be concise and clarify the benefit of the main task. We also have a section around experiences, talking about in-person retail, conversational experiences, so chatbots, things like that. And within that section, we have a very, very detailed section on error messages, which has been incredibly useful to me and hopefully lots of other people at Shopify. And here, again, an example of the detail we go into. Error messages should communicate severity using the appropriate color and tone of voice. Great. Okay, so why is content and design systems so great? It makes it easier to police content. I know that sounds terrible, and I want to just explain what I mean by that just a little bit. So, when you have great UX rationale and when you have rules that have been worked through and thought through, you have different kinds of conversations and you have better conversations. So you don't have someone saying, that looks weird to me, or I don't like how that looks, or if that content feels weird to me. You can go back to Polaris and say, oh, here's the reason why we choose to do X instead of Y. And if for some reason in a given situation you are tempted to not do that, or you want to have a discussion about why in a particular case it doesn't make sense to follow Polaris guidelines, you have a standard to refer back to. And it's again, I could talk about this for a lot longer, but the next point, the quality of content discussions are much better. And something else that happens is that because we've tested our components with content, when there is a content problem, or when we're trying to get a component to do something it wasn't designed to do, either from a visual perspective or from a content perspective, the system kind of acts like a tripwire. It's like, oh, the banner wasn't designed to do this, or the modal wasn't designed to confirm two actions at the same time. And when that happens, it allows you to take a step back, or ideally it allows you to take a step back and say, oh, is something not working in this flow upstream or downstream? Why are we getting stuck here? And so again, having those detailed guidelines and having a strong sense of what these components are designed to do helps you get out of certain situations when you get stuck. So not everything is perfect. Like, I think the world of Polaris, but it's important to point out that, it is not a utopia. No design system is perfect. And one of the things I've noticed is that because we have such detailed guidelines and because we have a fairly robust design system, sometimes people will assume that if something is live in product, it must be correct, instead of going back to Polaris as the source of truth. It doesn't happen all the time, but every once in a while, someone will say, oh, I did this, and you can see that they were copying something else that existed that wasn't up to date. And then the other thing, which is related to that, is that there's a lot of socializing work. There's a lot of reminding and keeping Polaris top of mind for people, because you need to build the habit of going back to a design system to confirm whether something is correct, or confirm that there's the component you want to use makes sense for what you're doing. It's not an instinct, I think, in most people, but it's definitely a habit that can be formulated. So last thing I wanted to talk about is contributing back to a design system. So starting in October of 2018, I had a chance to work on some onboarding guidelines. What you see here is just an article I wrote about that process. So in summary, when you have a UX team of 400, specialized knowledge has a tendency to stay specialized and hidden. In other words, I had worked a lot on onboarding, and I wanted to share that with the team because otherwise it would be very difficult to find. And someone else might try to solve the same problem, or get stuck in the same way that I did. And this was a way of helping the team do that. So as I just said, why do this? I had firsthand experience with onboarding. I'm a content strategist. I'm a writer, so doing more writing seems like a natural thing to do. I know some people find writing a little bit more like punishment, but obviously I love it. So creating more guidelines felt like a thing that I would enjoy doing. And most importantly, there was official encouragement to contribute back to Polaris. For a while, we had something called a Polaris tour, where members of Polaris would join a team, would embed in a team for a week, and figure out, what they were specialized in, what they knew a lot about, and what they could share back into Polaris. So these are just 2 screen grabs from the onboarding guidelines. As you can see, we ended up, go back, I had to create a fake app that we could use to walk through and talk about the different onboarding suggestions we were making. And here's what I learned from creating those guidelines. So first of all, none of it wouldn't have happened if I wouldn't have paired with Celine Hinckley. She did a lot of work. She works on the Polaris team. Very grateful for her help. What we ended up doing is time boxing those guidelines into a week-long sprint. We didn't finish them in a week necessarily, but that worked quite well. It was a lot of work. We had to create fake apps, and then principles over prescriptions. So what that means is, at first we had do this, but don't do that, and we realized it just wasn't going to work for something like onboarding, which is, very specific and unique to a given scenario or situation. Now, you don't have to spend weeks and weeks contributing back to a design system. Here's a much shorter example. This is directional language. So this is just the notion that you shouldn't say above or below or right or left when you are writing in UI copy. So this went very quickly. It went from a brief conversation on Slack. We had a first draft in 15 minutes. I had a short meeting with Celine where most of the time was just spent creating a PR, because the Polaris team has tried to make it as easy as possible for us to contribute back to the design system. And we went live a week or so later. And I'm going to end here by saying we started by talking about voice and tone, and now things are going in the opposite direction. Instead of spending all this energy on voice and tone, now we're saying maybe we don't need it. Here's another article forecasting the future from Airbnb. Same thing. A lot of writers don't use brand voice and tone words in their day-to-day. So instead, the future of that might rest with localization teams. So in summary, stress test your components with content. Create content advocates, not just on your content strategy team, but beyond. Socialize your design system regularly. Maintain and update your content regularly, and voice and tone guides might one day die off. So thank you. That's my Twitter handle. A little bit later today, maybe 10, 15 minutes from now, I will have a list of all the resources I've mentioned, and you can take a look at those when you want. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ryan. That was awesome. Really great talk. Thanks for sharing your process and contributing to Polaris. Even though I work at Shopify too, like all of that stuff is like new to me as well. So thank you for sharing that with me. Also, I was just thinking it was such a cool perspective that you were saying about how content should be looked at as patterns as opposed to just guidelines, and thinking it, I guess for me, putting it one-to-one to design, like design patterns and content patterns. So that's a super cool perspective that I just learned. So thank you for that. I think we have a lot of questions in the Slido. So I think I'll just go to Varun for the first question.
Yep.
I think we have about 5 or 6 minutes. So I think let's be mindful of the amount of questions too.
Perfect. Let's kick it off. So the first question, Ryan, is what's your process of testing the right voice and tone?
We have voice and tone guidelines on Polaris. They were recently updated. I think that my shortest answer to that is because we try to write at a grade 7 reading level, I put my content into a grade level reader. And often that makes what I am doing, if it is at a grade 7 level, very conversational. And that gets us, I would say, at least 50% of the way to hitting our voice and tone. There are obviously specific situations if it's an error message or if it's a celebratory message, but just making it plain language and conversational, again, gets us quite a bit of the way, and the voice and tone guidelines can sort of help fill in the rest of the gaps there.
Got it. Cool. All right, I'll go on to the next one. How do you avoid the problem of content guidelines simply gathering dust within a design system? How do you ensure they're easily accessible for everyone?
That's a great question. So again, we have, as I mentioned during the talk, we have the content guidelines, beside embedded in the components. That helps a lot in terms of, juxtaposition. Something else we do is when people onboard, a couple weeks after they join the company, they go through a week-long sort of onboarding camp. And one of the segments in that camp is we walk people through Polaris very quickly and then show them how to apply some of the content standards to some of their own work, regardless of whether they're an engineer or UX researcher or what discipline they come from. So we give them exposure to it, help them understand in a sort of quiz scenario how it works, and give them exposure early, and then try to remind people on a regular basis that this thing exists, it gets updated regularly, and it's worth using.
Awesome.
I can ask the next one. How can you start building a content strategy? Oh, it just moved. Capability when it is new to your org and when your UX writers have been focused on technical writing. So I guess, yeah, just the shift from technical writing to more content strategy and building that into a design system.
I mean, one way is to leverage the strengths or approaches that the team might have already been using on technical writing. So they may have already thought about patterns and approaches, and they may have also thought of a way of talking about the value of speaking consistently, or whatever tools they've developed to communicate clearly to people. That's a way to make a case for, hey, now we should do that in our product as well, like to be consistent around the value of this and what it means. But again, like just starting to document, oh, do we use the same words or the same phrasing on calls to action? Are we, is it a verb plus noun, or is it something else? Just taking a step back and looking for those patterns or approaches, that kind of invisible decisions that people have made about the UX writing up until that point, and start, slowly documenting it, and then developing rationale for why one thing is better than the other.
Right. Cool.
Awesome. I'll go for the next one. It's actually from Matthew Wheel. Can you talk about the intersection of engineering, content strategy, and design systems as it relates to building out digital experiences? Any challenges that you typically face there?
That's a good question. I mean, I can speak from the perspective of having seen and worked with front-end developers, and for them, knowing that there's a clear resource, around the components for different content situations is really helpful to them. Like, something we talk about at Shopify is that at some point, no matter what discipline you're in, you might be expected to ship content, to write and ship, readable, usable content. So part of it is having it in the right place, people knowing that it exists, but then also having people feel comfortable enough that if they need to do this thing, it's not the exclusive domain of a UX writer, that it's something that they can get very close and then, get someone else's approval on. So, yeah, and then the other piece is just maybe goes back to stress testing the components and like making sure that they make sense in those different scenarios, and that it works for engineers and front-end developers in the same way that it works on the UX side of things.
Awesome. I guess similar sort of question, and I'm just going to say last question too, because I think we're just cutting in on time. How do you go about testing components with content? What is the process, or what is your process?
I mean, so probably a longer than a minute answer, but we know that in, like, let's take a banner, for example. We know that simply space-wise, only so much information will fit in it, and so we have guidelines around keeping the headline short and keeping the body to 2 sentences. We also have rules around, primary and secondary CTAs. But that work was done as part of the lead up to Polaris going public. So we sort of went on a piece by piece basis, and there's ongoing, obviously new components are added over time and new work is done. But I guess that is part of, I haven't had firsthand experience with that stress testing the components, but that is a consideration that is done before it gets to be added into the system. That it doesn't just look nice or, looks visually consistent with what we've done before, but it's the component can say the right things in the right scenarios.
Nice. So I guess through A/B testing or just usability testing, when the team is building out those components within the design system.
Yeah, that could be one way. And another tool we have is a text expander to help us understand how a component might look if it was in another language, because a lot of languages other than English are considerably longer. So that would be a consideration. That and then also making sure that it works in our app or in a mobile scenario.
Great, makes sense. I think that's all we have. Thank you, Ryan, so much for joining us today. We're gonna
Thank you. Appreciate it.
A virtual clap. Awesome. Okay, so we will go on to our next speaker. So our next speaker is Jacqui. She's a UX writer and content strategist in Toronto. She has a background in linguistics, English literature, and second language teaching. She's developed digital content for Kobo, Canadian Tire, Fast Retailing, which is Uniqlo, Shaw, and several other startups. So if you have a moment and you want to ask her some questions, ask her about her feelings around the Oxford comma. And so today she will be speaking to us about content for design systems and measuring success and what that looks like. So I'm just going to say another reminder about Slido. If you guys have questions during the presentation, to just use the Slido link to put down your questions, and then also feel free to rank them too. So if you want that particular question to be asked, just upvote it. And yeah, welcome, Jacqui.
Hi there. Thanks very much. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about measuring the success of the content you create for a design system. So kind of building on what Ryan was saying, crafting the content that you're going to contribute to a design system. It's good to create that content with an eye to measuring its success and figuring out whether it's actually achieving what you want it to achieve. So I'll start with a quick overview of a design system, what it is, what's in it. I know I'll burn through that pretty quickly. I'm pretty sure we all know essentially what a design system is, but just what kinds of content you might be creating, and who's using it and why, what they're trying to get out of it, because that always informs our writing. So how do we write that content? And then how do we set standards for the content? And how do we measure the success of the content in a design system? So a design system is a collection of reusable components guided by clear standards that can be assembled together to build any number of applications. And I've often seen it referred to as the one source of truth within a design system, for an organization or for anyone who's building a series of digital experiences. And so that's true mainly for design and development, but it's also for other people within the organization or within that process, certainly content writers. From my friends and my former colleagues at Wrangle, here's a design system. So check out their blog and podcast, by the way. Varun and Catherine do an excellent job in laying out information about what a what a design system is and what it can be. So generally, the design kit and the developer sandbox are kind of black boxes to me. I've never created content for those. But as for the rest of them, I've created content for describing the design language. So things like the typography and colors and the spacing and grid, explaining to people sort of the value of them, and then like the parameters of like what they are and what they, how they should be used. A component library and the documentation that Ryan was just discussing for things like, describing buttons and drop downs and all that good stuff. And of course, accessibility guidelines as well should be baked into that. And governance and principles. So a lot of times, if you're starting from scratch with a design system, a new one, design principles are kind of like the overarching guiding light for the content that you're creating, and then also for the end product that the people the people who are using your design system are actually going to create. So designers and developers, first and foremost, and designers include everybody from the visual team, the UX team, and content, and the developers all the way through from juniors to technical directors, front end, back end. And our secondary audience, I included this because I think too, sometimes when we're creating, we can kind of dig down a little too deep and have it just be a designer and developer party, when essentially the marketing team, the executive team, and the general public are also interested in your design system approach and creating digital content. Like Ryan was saying, there's some, there's lots of people writing articles and discussing, what the best methods are and what the best approaches are for UX writing. And I honestly think that having accessible content, both from the sense of accessibility, but also accessible to people beyond your immediate organization, is important. So what do all these people want to achieve? But again, primarily designers and developers. But what do they want to achieve? And so to my mind, the best way to really create the right kind of content for these people who are in the process of creating great digital experiences is to just ask them. So send out surveys, ask around, do some card sorts to say like, what's your preference? What do you need to see? What's going to help you in your day-to-day when actually making the decisions of like what to use in this digital experience? Should this be a button? Should this be a link? Should we use an accordion here? What exactly is the content that's actually, for the most part, we've got some pretty good examples in like existing design systems, but there may be particular needs within your organization that need to be addressed. So how are we going to write this content for a design system? And take some care and with a thought for how the content, and with an eye towards how the content succeeds or fails. So,
hey, Jacqui.
Yeah.
Sorry, 2 seconds. Sorry to interrupt. Wondering if you could just move your mic away from your zipper, because as you are talking, it's just scraping against your zipper.
Oh.
Just your mic, yeah.
I don't have a mic. I'm using the internal mic on my computer.
Oh, just your headphones. The cord.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay.
That's perfect.
So am I moving? Okay.
No, that's perfect. Thank you so much.
No problem. No worries. I never even thought about it. So how do we write content for a design system? Let's think about how we judge digital content. And again, Ryan had touched on this a bit about one of the questions was, sort of metrics for judging like the end user's content. So for marketing or persuasive content, so things like in banner ads, we think about things like click-through rates or how many people added to cart or bounce rates. This is an example of some copy I did, an A/B test I did when I was at Canadian Tire, where we checked to see if shorter, punchier copy would actually increase our click-through rates and applications for credit cards. And it did. That, I think, was about 22% increase for shorter. So measuring success for that kind of content is something we can also use as like a background. It's something we should use to inform how we test the content within a design system. For instructional type copy or something that gets people to move, through a flow or something, did they have a successful onboarding experience? Here, that's the kind of things we test, like, are they able to accomplish the task? Are there reduced call volumes to customer service teams saying, hey, what can I do? How can I make this thing happen? And in this case, I've shown an example of how I changed the copy when I was at Kobo and working on black and white e-reader. Formerly, they had used the verb archive to talk about moving your books around. You could archive it here, you could archive it there. And instead, I tested and encouraged a shift away from archiving to remove, and then made it very clear exactly where you were taking your book from and whether you could get them back. So this was all about like the consequences of your actions and making sure that's clear. So making sure that that's clear to people is, and testing to see if that is clear to people is a way to ensure that that content is successful. But what I'd like to encourage you to consider is that rather than persuasive or instructional, the content within a design system is more educational. And so we have to measure its success beyond just a click-through rate or a successful task. So because the design system is it's a larger system, and it's not just a one-off or a quick success or fail. I think that looking at it from the perspective of educational content, helps us to think about how we can build on existing mental models, both about the digital experience that designers and developers are creating and the actual design system itself. So this allows the user to learn, absorb the information, and not simply continually use the design system as a point of reference and go back, hopefully. And this way it's more holistic, and it doesn't mean we shouldn't take into account the other two forms of metrics, but it's something to kind of push beyond. So teaching users how to use the design system, how to find information, and how to build both the digital experience they're creating and the design system itself. So this is IBM's system Carbon. And I think the structures there pretty elegantly teach the user how to, most design systems are set up pretty successfully that way, but some more so than others. So one of the things that I wanted to say is that if we're going to think of the content as educational, then taking users' learning styles into account is something that can help you bake in a success metric. Now, there isn't actually technically a lot of support for the idea or for the theory of learning styles. There's not a lot of evidence to support that this is true. However, I think it's still valuable to keep these in mind because there are a lot of people who think of themselves as visual learners or as oral learners. Because I know when I look at this, visual learners, prefer diagrams or icons. And oral learners prefer to have things read to them. Those who prefer reading, writing, they are doodlers or writers. And tactile, obviously, they prefer to actually get in there and try to do it. And interactive learners like to talk the idea through, and kinesthetic learners like to get up and move around. And actually, again, physically do an action. I know when I look at that, I think to myself, well, I'm not a visual learner. I'm someone who much prefers some combination of reading and writing and interactive. I need to talk ideas through, and I need to make notes for myself to contextualize the information in my own words. So I think in doing that, in approaching your content with these learning styles, again, very broadly defined in mind, it can help us create effective content. But one of the things that I do think from an educational perspective does help is if we borrow a little bit from schema theory and linguistics, which is a framework that you can use to approach content creation as well, and make sure that the content that you're creating takes into consideration the reader's active attempt to activate the relative schema or the underlying mental models they have about the content they're looking at. So letter sound relationships, syntactic knowledge, word meanings, all those kinds of things. Use the language that they use, and make sure that you're presenting it to them in a way that makes sense to them, which is pretty obvious. Selectivity is the second characteristic, and that refers to the reader's ability to attend selectively to the actual information that they want. So make sure that the information you've got on your page is chunked in such a way that they can find it, or it's highlighted with headings and subheadings so that they can pick through and quickly find what they want, because you don't want to deplete or overextend their the third element, which is their cognitive energy or the cognitive load. Our brain has a limited ability or a limited amount of energy for processing information. So like focusing on decoding will take a user out of the experience, or will, overwhelm them. So you got to lean on your best practices for UX writing, a lot of which Ryan just covered. So you want things to be clear, so they're well written and the consequences are evident. You want things to be concise. You don't want to use any more words than you absolutely have to. And it's consistent. Things like Ryan was saying, the verbs are your buttons, verbs plus a noun. Contextually relevant, so the message and the information appears where it's needed and not later on. So things like inline messages rather than, pardon me, something, at the very bottom of a page telling you, oh, go back and fix the postal code. And prioritized. So terms and conditions, for example, can go to the very bottom because they're not necessarily the things that they may be relevant to some users, but for the most part, the priority is on the page for more relevant tasks. So how are we going to measure success of a design system and its content? The tests, I think, ultimately are for you to determine and for you and your team to figure out in terms of how much, how fast, how often. But I think that in general, we need to take it beyond clicks and tasks. And like I said, appeal to the idea that this is educational content that allows people to continue to grow with the content. And here are some sort of like broad buckets for determining what makes successful content in a design system. So are your users, your developers and your designers and your content designers and everyone, are they finding the information they want? How long does it take? And are they how are they actually doing that? Are they going through the navigation? Are they using the search bar? Are they coming in through organic search? And then when they're actually on the page, are they clicking around the information where the user expects it to be? Now you could probably, you could do some user testing for this. You could straight up send out surveys asking people. You could do, pop-ups when they're actually on the page. It's a way to make sure that in the moment, the information is exactly where it needs to be. Are they understanding the information? Is it the language, like what the user would expect? Are headings and subheadings and all that sort of thing consistent? And does the content appeal to those different learning styles? Again, in a very broad sense, like infographics or videos or things like that. Are you making the content as rich as it can be? Because the richness of the content will help the user have an experience that I think will be more rewarding and more worthwhile, and allows them again to move from just individual tasks to incorporating the information in a sort of systematic way. Are they applying the information? Are your users taking the information that's on the page that's within this design system and then using it to make choices about their work. So our designer is going, oh, okay, according to this description for a button and this description for a link, it looks like I need to use a button in this case. You know, developers are getting to do whatever magical developer things do. Because I can't think of an example right now. I realize I only wrote an example for designers. Applying that information also means, can they then extrapolate from what's written to create something completely new? So if they want to create a new component, then have they got a baseline sample of what all the thought processes that go into it, like the accessibility rules and how to write an URL label and blah, 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 so that they can create a new component without it being like a major issue for them. Are they advocating for the information? So do users say, do designers say to other designers and developers to other developers, use this design system because it's got the answers you need? Or did they say, no, I'll just explain it to you myself? And you can check things like that by using the adoption rates for the design system. You can see that there's, find out if there's buy-in for the design system throughout the organization, if everybody up and down the ladder promotes it and encourages its use, say, introduces it to people in their onboarding. That's a great way to know that the information is valued within the organization and that it is successful, at least on some levels. I would also say that finally, building on information is probably one of the most worthwhile ways. The design system, is it generating feedback from the users? Are people asking questions and asking for things to be added? Or are they asking for things to be clarified on the existing entries? So if you have like an email or some, I don't know if they would have customer service representatives, but someone who's answering those queries, then you'll have a sense of how much of a living document this design system is and how useful the content actually is. And if there's a sense of ownership where people feel like, yeah, you know what, this is a good description. I like this description of the typography, but I still feel like that's not quite the right word that we would use. Can we please change it to this? That's honestly probably one of the best recommendations there can be, because people want things to be better and they want to help out and chip in. That's a really good way of determining success of your content. So in short, you need to think about your end user. And in our case, that's mostly designers and developers and content creators ourselves. Ask them what they want, write for them, like really write for them, and think of the content as educational with that educational bent of learning styles. Employ your best practices, test your content, consider what you want the content to achieve and what you want it to be. Keep iterating and stay curious. So that's it. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jacqui. Really appreciate you taking out the time and coming up and talking to our design systems community. I think we have a bunch of questions that we're going to start from Slido. I'll pass it on to Lucy to ask the first question.
Yep. So the first question is from James. Hey, James. I know James. Hi, Jacqui. How do you handle business stakeholders when they want to dictate the content produced to meet their needs instead of the users? It's a really good question.
That's a really good question. It's something that I think, so the business needs always assert themselves, right? And I think this is one of those ones where if you can get some data behind you, you can make some data-informed decisions. So I always like to end any presentation or any talk or any article I write with stay curious. So hopefully approaching that from the perspective of, oh, okay, I'm actually not sure if your approach would work or this approach would work, but we have a lot of tools at our disposal, you know, everything from A/B testing to, you know, user testing. to like take something as a hypothesis and just say, could we test that? Would you mind if we gave that a try? Because it doesn't have to be about who's right and who's wrong. It has to be about what we can support.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. And also, yeah, I guess just bringing it back to our design process too, and testing the assumptions or testing whatever people are saying, to making sure that, yeah, we have that data to support whatever we're saying.
For sure. Yeah. And always, like, to my mind, it's always phrasing it in the form of, I'm not sure. Can we check? Because it's curiosity is much more valuable, I think, than, sort of taking any kind of hard position one way or the other.
Awesome. That's great advice. Varun, next one.
Yeah, I'll ask the next one. So are there any approaches or advices you have when it comes to getting buy-in from designers and developers and moving to a content in design system approach?
Oh, that's really interesting. I haven't actually, because I haven't worked on a design system that incorporated content to the extent that I would love to see it. The people at Deliveroo did a really good article, if you want to look it up, all about incorporating content into design systems. Honestly, in my experience, most of the designers and developers I've worked with have been thrilled to have guidelines and patterns of the type that Ryan was talking about for content, because content seems to be a bit of a black box for them, just as much as a design kit or a developer sandbox would be for me. So I guess I would say that ultimately that's another one where you have to say, like, well, who's our end user? Our end user for the products we're creating is not a developer and is not a designer. Maybe they are, but they're not the bulk of the users. And so we have to think about what's valuable for them. And hopefully, like, content is that bridge between the design and the development and the end user. And hopefully you can make the case there.
Totally. Yeah, I think you can easily relate this to the values that we put in the beginning, right? Like customer first approach, like the organization where I work at, that's typically what the approach we have. And I think content plays a big role in making that experience possible.
For sure.
Awesome. All right, Lucy, to you.
I think that's it, right? Do you see any other questions? Yeah, I don't think there's any more questions.
I think there's a generic one, maybe that we can ask Jacqui, is like, are there any books or articles you recommend to sort of get like in front of like content and design systems?
Not a lot of people are writing specifically about creating content for design systems. I will say that there's lots of great books about UX writing and content. Christina Halverson, and the name is beyond me right now, but it's interesting that Ryan brought up the UK.gov design system, because they have excellent guidelines on content. Just Don't Make Me Think is also, like, in and of itself, I think a really great way for someone who is maybe used to writing more of that persuasive marketing copy to start thinking about their content a little bit more as in the service of user experience. If UX seems to be a bit of a vague, hazy term to you, and you want to kind of like make that switch to go from, maybe doing email blasts or, some more persuasive or hype type writing into something a little bit more UX-y.
Awesome. I think one thing we could do probably after this is create a list of these sort of articles or book recommendations, and we can just share a tweet so our followers or the folks that have asked the questions can have direct links to that. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Jacqui. Really appreciate you coming in.
Thanks for having me.
Love the talk.
Thank
and
you.
Thank you for answering the questions.
All right, so our next meetup is in June, sometime in June. We're thinking probably the first week on a Wednesday, like we do every other month. So stay tuned on the topic. So we'll share out anything that, the topics and the speakers shortly. So stay tuned to our social. And I think that is it for our meetup today.
Is it time?
It's time.
Thank you very much for attending, everyone. Hope you had an online blast, and we would really like to know what you thought about it. So please send us your feedback. There is a link in the YouTube description below with this exact bit.ly link you see on the slide, DSC-May 6, or you can scan the QR code to fill a Google form. Let us know how the talks were. What did you think? Leave all your feedback with us, and please be sure to like and subscribe. You are watching on YouTube after all.
Just, a quick shout out again to our speakers today. It was our first remote session, and we wanted to make sure it was run smoothly as possible. So thank you for everyone for joining. And I think it was also sort of our first global event. So hi to other countries and cities and stuff. So we welcome you. And thank you again, Jacqui and Ryan and Enrico and Varun, obviously, for putting this on. Thank you guys.
Yeah, and follow us on our social handles. We keep posting good information. We'll have Ryan and Jacqui do a post as well so we can repost that. So thank you again, everyone.
Sorry, one thing to note, if you guys have further questions, I think there are some other questions that were put into Slido that we couldn't actually get to as well. I think we will be sharing Jacqui and Ryan's Twitter and social handles, so feel free to reach out to them. They said that they would be more than happy to have a chat. So yeah, just wanted to add that in.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you.
Bye, guys.
Bye, Jacqui. Bye, Ryan.
Bye.
Bye. Bye-bye.